It started with a $50 fine slipped under my door, noise violation, unauthorized wind chime. That's all it said. No warning. No neighbor complaint. Just a citation from a board I never voted for in a town I thought I understood. But that little slip of paper opened a door I didn't know existed. And behind it was a machine of corruption, silenced voices, and something much worse than wind chimes. It started with a faint clinking sound, soft bamboo rods knocking gently in a breeze, a tune only nature could write. The wind chime was a simple thing, hand-carved, uneven, and painted with faint traces of lavender and gray. My sister had made it for me just before she passed. It was the last thing she gave me, and I hung it up on the front porch of my new home in Hollow Glen, a place that promised peace. The streets were quiet, the neighbors polite, and the lawns trim enough to seem unreal. I'd moved here for the silence, but silence, I soon learned, had layers. The fine came on a Tuesday morning. I opened my front door and found a folded yellow envelope pinned to the side of my mailbox with blue masking tape. No return address, no signature, just a generic notice from the Hollow Glen Homeowners Association citing me for a noise violation, unauthorized wind chime. $50, due in 10 days. No warning, no record of a complaint, just a demand. I stood on the porch, still holding my coffee, staring at the paper. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the HOA thought I was using power tools at night, or maybe someone had confused me with another unit. But the notice was specific. It even described the wind chime as obstructive to the auditory peace of the community. I read it twice. Then I looked around the street, scanning for anyone nearby. A jogger passed by across the cul-de-sac and nodded politely. An elderly man, 2 houses down, stood watering his lawn, looking in my direction, then quickly looked away. I went back inside and placed the fine on the kitchen table. For an hour, I tried to shrug it off. After all, it was just $50. But something about it itched. A fine for a wind chime? I'd never heard of such a rule in the paperwork when I signed the HOA documents. I pulled out the welcome packet and scoured it for anything about sound ordinances. Lawn care, paint colors, approved roofing materials, pages of that. But not a single mention of decorative items on porches or specific noise limitations. The next day, I called the HOA office. A woman answered with a rehearsed monotone that sounded like she was reading from a script. I gave her my address, name, and explained the situation. She put me on hold for 10 minutes before returning with an answer that made even less sense than the fine. According to Article 7, Section 4 of the Hollow Glen Serenity Code, exterior noise-making devices are subject to approval by the HOA board. I asked where this Serenity Code was. It hadn't been in any of the documents I received. She paused, then said, "It's an internal guideline, not publicly distributed." Then how can I be fined for violating something I wasn't given? I'm sorry, sir. If you'd like to appeal, you can attend the next board hearing. It's scheduled for next month. You'll need to submit a written request by the 15th. I hung up before she finished her sentence. Internal guideline. That's not how fines work. You can't enforce secret rules. I was angry now, not over the money, but the principle. I printed out a letter of appeal that night and mailed it to the address listed on the fine. 3 days later, I found the wind chime gone. Just gone. String snap, no trace. Not even on the lawn. The small hook where it hung twisted slightly, like someone had yanked it in haste. No note this time. I walked down the sidewalk, checking nearby bushes. Nothing. I knocked on my next-door neighbor's door. A soft-spoken woman in her 50s named Denise. She opened slowly and gave me a look that said she didn't want to talk, but she smiled anyway. "Hey, Denise, did you happen to see anyone take something off my porch last night?" My wind chime disappeared. Her face tensed just a bit before she forced a sympathetic shake of her head. "No, I didn't see anything. Probably just the wind. The wind doesn't take things down the street. It was tied up. I wouldn't worry too much about it," she said. "Things like that, they have a way of disappearing if the board isn't happy." Then she closed the door, not waiting for my response. It wasn't just a fine anymore. Someone had come onto my property, taken something personal, and no one wanted to talk about it. The neighborhood that once seemed friendly now felt like a film set. The smiles were still there, The waves at the mailbox, the children on bicycles. But something had shifted. I began noticing that conversations died when I walked by. People looked away too quickly. Cars slowed in front of my house and idled a few seconds too long. A few nights later, I heard footsteps outside my window around midnight. I turned off the light and peered through the blinds. A man in a navy windbreaker was crouched by my porch, inspecting something. I yanked the door open and stepped out, but he was already halfway down the sidewalk by the time I shouted. I couldn't see his face, just the HOA logo stitched on the back of the jacket. I didn't even know they had jackets. The next day, I received a second notice. This time, it cited non-compliance with visual property harmony. My recycling bin, apparently, had not been tucked back into its designated zone behind my fence. Another $50 fine. I was starting to see a pattern, and I wasn't the first. Later that week, I found a folded piece of paper under my welcome mat. No signature, no name. Just a sentence written in scratchy blue pen. You're not the first. Be careful what you hang. That's when I stopped thinking of it as a fine and started thinking of it as a warning. I couldn't let it go. After the second fine, and especially after the note slipped beneath my doormat, I realized this wasn't about rules. It wasn't even about the Windchime anymore. Something was going on beneath the surface of this pristine little neighborhood, and I was either going to ignore it like everyone else, or I was going to start digging. I started with the basics. I pulled out every document I had received when I bought the house. Welcome packets, HOA bylaws, community guidelines. I read through them line by line. There was nothing about wind chimes, nothing about recycling bins needing to be out of sight, and certainly nothing about any Serenity code. I double-checked the local ordinances online. Still nothing. That's when I realized something strange. The Hollow Glen HOA operated with an unusual level of autonomy. More than a typical homeowners association should legally have. I went online and searched for past complaints. Most of what I found was clean, too clean. There were a few vague threads on neighborhood forums, some deleted posts, and a single Yelp review from 3 years ago that simply read, "You don't want to get on their radar." Trust me, I began keeping notes. Every car that idled in front of my home. Every interaction I had with the neighbors. I even started photographing the violations they fined me for. I took pictures of my recycling bin, neatly placed at the side of the house. I took videos of the porch where the Windchime used to hang, with audio to prove it made almost no noise. One evening, while walking my dog, I saw an older man in a flannel jacket moving slowly along the edge of his property. I'd seen him before, always quiet, always alone. His name was Mr. Weaver. His house was at the far end of the cul-de-sac, the only one with a fence that hadn't been painted in HOA-approved beige. He caught me looking and gave a short nod. I nodded back and decided to take a chance. "You ever get fined for something stupid?" I asked casually. He gave me a look, long, steady, then motioned for me to walk with him. "They fined me for my mailbox," he said. 3 years ago. Said the color didn't match community aesthetics. Funny thing is, I never painted it. It came with the house. "What did you do?" "I paid it," he said, shrugging. But that wasn't the end of it. Next month, they said my hedges were aggressively shaped. Then my house number plaque was non-standard. Then I stopped getting my meeting notices. Well, I showed up anyway. They said it was members only. I asked who was on the board. They said it was confidential for their protection. He looked around, then leaned closer. "There's a reason no one fights them. You do, and your life gets complicated." "How complicated?" "You still have your job, your insurance, your clean record." He raised an eyebrow. "People lose things around here when they make noise." I left the conversation unsettled. I hadn't thought about it until then, but things had started shifting in my life recently. Emails from my boss asking for explanations about time off I hadn't taken. My insurance suddenly requesting proof of my permanent residence. My bank calling to confirm recent changes to my address, changes I hadn't made. They were reaching outside the neighborhood. I began documenting everything. I purchased a pocket recorder and kept it on me at all times. I downloaded a dashcam app for my phone and mounted it in the front window. I installed motion lights around the house and ordered a cheap surveillance camera for the porch. I knew I was stepping into something bigger than a petty neighborhood spat, but I had no idea just how deep it went. The more I researched, the more patterns I found. Property records showed that several homes on my street had changed hands multiple times in just a few years. Each sale was fast, below market value, and followed by a string of violations before the owner moved out. It wasn't just annoying bureaucracy, it was targeted. I tracked down one of the previous homeowners, a woman named Rachel, through a real estate listing site. Her name still came up on a few cache directories. I found her on social media and sent a message. She responded the next day. We spoke over the phone. Her voice was tight, anxious. They do it on purpose, she told me. They pick one thing: a fence, a light fixture, a lawn gnome. Then they start piling on the violations. You fight one, they hit you with two more. You go to the board, they say the board is private. You ask for records, they charge you $500 in processing fees. Then they star on your credit, your workplace. Your car gets towed for no reason. It doesn't stop until you sell. Why? I asked. Because they're flipping properties. They force you out, then sell to one of their holding companies. They renovate with HOA contractors, all of them friends or family, and resell at a profit. Isn't that illegal? It should be, she said bitterly. But they write their own rules. And no one fights them because no one stays long enough to finish the fight. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a homeowner and started feeling like a target. I went to the local records office and pulled public reports on the HOA leadership. The president, Arthur Kessler, owned 3 LLCs. One of them had purchased 4 homes in the neighborhood in the last 5 years. Another was registered as a maintenance contractor for HOA-approved repairs. It was a loop, a cycle of control, fines, coercion, acquisition. That night, I stood out on my porch and looked at the empty space where my sister's Windchime had once hung. I couldn't help thinking that it was the first stone thrown, the beginning of a landslide they didn't think I'd see coming. But I wasn't going anywhere. They wanted me to shut up, to move out quietly like everyone else. They had no idea what I was about to do. At first, I thought I was alone. The paranoia, the sleepless nights, the notes, the constant feeling of being watched. I thought it was just happening to me. That's how they wanted it to feel. Isolated. Personal. But once I dug past the surface, I began to see the pattern. And once I started finding the others, the silence started to make a new kind of noise. I found the first real lead buried in the local library's archived newspapers. It was an old column, barely a few paragraphs long, in the Hollow Glen Weekly Observer. Dated 7 years ago. The headline read, "Local man challenges HOA in court. Case dismissed without comment." His name was Jordan Valenti. The article didn't say much, just that he had filed a civil suit against the Hollow Glen Homeowners Association citing malicious fines, abuse of power, and procedural obstruction. The court threw the case out for lack of jurisdiction. No follow-up articles. No updates. It was like he tried to start a fire, and someone immediately buried it in sand. I tried finding Jordan. Online searches turned up an old LinkedIn profile, inactive. No social media. No forwarding address. A few clicks deeper, I found a community blog post from an anonymous user referencing a man named JV who had vanished in the middle of litigation. It felt like fiction, except I was already living inside the same story. More names surfaced as I kept looking. A couple who'd left their home 2 blocks away, seemingly overnight. No goodbye, no sale listing, no moving truck. An elderly woman named Miss Carla who used to walk her dog around the neighborhood every morning. She hadn't been seen in weeks. Someone said she'd moved in with family out of state. Someone else said her house was bought in cash by a development trust. No one could say where she went. Her home, sold, renovated, and resold within 2 months. I decided to knock on a few doors. Most stayed closed. Others opened just a crack. One woman, maybe in her 70s, answered and looked like she might cry just from seeing me on her porch. I asked gently if she'd ever had issues with the HOA. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They fine me for keeping my curtains closed during the day," she said, as if she still couldn't believe it. Said it made the home look uninviting. I asked if she appealed it. She shook her head. "No one wins. You don't fight them. You survive them." When I mentioned Jordan Valenti, her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer. "He was brave," she said. "Too brave. He tried to get people together. Neighborhood meetings, flyers, letters to council. He even went to the local paper. But they made him disappear. You mean they kicked him out? I mean he disappeared. No forwarding address. No notice. No one's seen him since. She closed the door before I could ask anything else. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept my lights off and stared out through the blinds. 2 black SUVs passed by my house between midnight and 2 a.m. Slow, deliberate. No plates, just shadows. The next day, I drove 2 towns over to visit someone I'd been told might know more. His name was Theo, and he used to be a building inspector for the county before he took early retirement. He didn't live in Hollow Glen, but he'd been there plenty. I found him in a rundown duplex, surrounded by tools and old folders of permits and blueprints. Hollow Glen, he said, raising an eyebrow. That's a strange one. How so? They started doing things their own way about a decade ago. Bought out a few contractors, formed their own inspection team. Technically legal if the HOA charters it. But here's the weird part. Permits for that neighborhood are always closed off. They use a third-party agency that reports directly to their board, not the county. Is that allowed? Barely. It's a loophole. But it means no one sees what they're building, what they're changing, or who owns what once it's inside the walls. He handed me a manila envelope. Photocopies of permit requests and approval stamps. Most of them for vague terms like infrastructure enhancement and private compliance. No one outside the HOA had oversight. It was a sealed loop. I asked him about the fines. Oh, that's just the surface, he said. Those fines are pressure. Psychological. Get people off balance, force compliance, or make them want to sell. The real money's in the turnover. They identify the most vulnerable, single homeowners, elderly, people who've just gone through divorce or death in the family, then bleed them out with rules. And if they resist, he looked at me carefully. They don't get to resist for long. By the time I returned home, I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I was angry. Furious. There were stories here. People who had lived quietly, paid their dues, followed the rules, and were still driven out, silenced, or made to vanish. I went to the local newspaper and asked for the journalist who had written the original story on Valeni. No one on staff had heard of him. I asked to see the print archives. They told me those files had been misplaced during the digital transition. Even the paper trail was being erased. And yet, the stories kept surfacing, whispered, half-told, hidden inside glances and brief moments of courage. There was the woman who said her dog had been poisoned the day after she challenged a property violation. The young couple who claimed their water lines had been tampered with. A man who said his brake lines had been cut the week he tried to run for an open board seat. I started writing everything down. Every name, every address, every violation I could trace. And then something happened that I didn't expect. One evening, I found another note under my doormat. This one said, "You're not alone. Keep going. When the time comes, we'll back you." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was different this time. Neater. Purposeful. For the first time since this all began, I realized something important. The silence in Hollow Glen wasn't just fear. It was waiting for someone to speak loud enough that others could follow. And whether I liked it or not, that someone had become me. It was a burner phone. Disposable, no contact ID, cheap plastic casing with smudge buttons. It rang just once and stopped. I'd given the number to exactly one person. An anonymous tip I'd received through an encrypted email address a week earlier, claiming to be from someone inside the board who wanted to talk. The instructions had been specific. Buy a burner, wait for contact, and don't speak to anyone else until you did. When it rang a second time, I answered. The voice on the other end was steady, cautious, but tired. Not synthetic, not robotic, just worn down. Someone who had been carrying too much for too long. "You've been asking questions," the voice said. "You're making them nervous." "Who is this?" "I used to be the numbers guy," the voice replied, until I asked the wrong question. He told me his name was Darren, though I didn't know if that was true. He claimed he had been the Hollow Glen HOA's accountant for nearly 6 years. Not public-facing, not on the official board listings, but essential. The person who signed off on budgets, vendor payments, community maintenance, and most importantly, fines. I asked why he left. "They wanted me to fake invoices," he said flatly. "Write checks to companies that didn't exist. Pad construction costs." Charge triple for plumbing repairs that never happened. The fines were just the start. They used them to pressure homeowners into surrendering or selling. Once the house was empty, they'd pass it off to a shell company. Same board members, different paperwork. And you went along with this? Until I didn't, he said. When I started asking questions, things changed. My car was broken into. Someone wiped my home computer. I came home one night, and the locks had been changed. HOA security said it was a safety precaution. That's when I ran. He was calling from another state now. Said he didn't want to say where. Safer for both of us, he told me. But he had proof. Files, audio, transactions. He hadn't dared go to the authorities directly. Didn't trust them. Too many former cops on the HOA board. Too many connections. I've been holding on to this stuff for 2 years, he said. Waiting for someone to come along who might actually do something with it. We arranged to meet in a neutral place, a rest stop diner off the highway 2 towns over. I wore a baseball cap and hoodie, unsure if it made me look more suspicious or less. Darren was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth with a laptop bag resting on the seat beside him. He looked unremarkable. Brown hair, hollow cheeks, eyes that didn't stay on anything for too long. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he slid a small USB drive across the table and said, "It's all there." What exactly am I looking at? Scanned invoices, bank transfers, voice memos, screenshots from the board's private Slack, a list of properties acquired through fine enforcement, a breakdown of how those properties were rerouted to Kessler's investment fund and flipped through HOA-approved contractors. Kessler, the HOA president, untouchable, untouchably smug. Is there enough here to get the authorities involved? I asked. There's enough here to burn the whole neighborhood down. He warned me, though. They're watching everything. Mail, phone, traffic cams. You're probably already flagged. I asked why he'd risked giving it to me. Why now? Because you didn't fold, he said. Everyone else does. You got louder. And the louder you get, the more they'll try to make you quiet. This is your insurance. We didn't talk long. He didn't eat. Didn't even order coffee. After 15 minutes, he stood and left, disappearing into a line of cars heading north. I never saw him again. I took the drive home and made 3 copies. One I stored in a safety deposit box in another county. One I uploaded to a secure cloud folder buried under layers of dummy files. The third I kept with me. The files were staggering. Meticulous. Every dollar traced. Every trick revealed. There were renovation budgets that tripled after homes changed hands, despite no visible upgrades. Fines that had no legal backing funneled directly into discretionary funds that paid for executive retreats in the mountains. Lists of targeted homeowners, many elderly, widowed, or recently divorced, flagged as vulnerable candidates for transition. One audio file shook me the most. It was a recording of a board meeting, one that, by HOA law, should have been open to the public. But this one was private, held off-site. Kessler's voice was unmistakable. If they want to play hardball, we'll just cite them until they beg us to buy them out, he said, calm-measured. It's cheaper than negotiation. We're not running a charity here. We're optimizing. Another board member laughed. You really think they'll keep falling for it? They always do, Kessler replied. No one wants to be the martyr in a neighborhood full of strangers. Fear makes people rational. That was when I realized this wasn't just corruption. It was predation, and it had been going on for years. I printed copies of the most damning documents, highlighted key names, accounts, and transfers. I mailed anonymous packets to 3 different local news outlets, 1 city council member, and an investigative podcast that specialized in neighborhood corruption. But it wasn't enough. I knew how these things went. Evidence disappears. Files get lost. Journalists get worn off. If this was going to stick, I had to go public. Fully. Loudly. I called the podcast directly. The producer was skeptical until I described the audio files. Then he got quiet. Asked if I'd be willing to appear anonymously. Voice changed. Face hidden. They could protect me, he said. But I'd have to talk. I agreed. 2 weeks later, the episode aired. The Fine Line. How a neighborhood turned against its own. It was downloaded over 200,000 times in the first day. Local stations picked it up. Reporters started showing up in Hollow Glen. One even got chased off the premises by a security team. who claimed the sidewalks were private property. Then the phone call started. First, they were angry. Board members claiming slander, legal threats, cease and desist letters. Then they got quieter. Requests to meet, clarify, offers to resolve things amicably. And then, just like Darren warned, the real pushback began. My trash was dumped across my lawn one morning. I received an anonymous call from someone claiming to be from the IRS, questioning my employment history. A neighbor I barely knew shouted at me in the street, accusing me of tearing down what good people built. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not now. Because the truth was out there. And someone finally was listening. It started with the sound of shattering glass. I had just sat down at my desk when I heard it, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. I rushed to the front porch, and there it was, my windshield spiderweb with a single deliberate blow. Nothing was stolen. No note. Just the quiet message of violence. My car, parked beneath the street lamp in plain view of the neighborhood, had been marked. Not vandalized out of impulse, targeted. I called the police. They arrived late, took a few photos, and gave me a standard report slip. The officer didn't seem interested when I told him I suspected the HOA was behind it. His tone flattened. No witnesses? No, but no cameras? No footage. I've had other threats. I'm working with. He shook his head. You'll need something concrete. Without evidence, it's just speculation. Probably kids. I could see in his eyes he wasn't going to do anything. Whether it was laziness, indifference, or something worse, I didn't know. But it was clear that the system around Hollow Glen was working for someone, and it wasn't residents like me. The next morning, my mailbox had been opened and left hanging loose on its hinges. The screws weren't missing. They were still on the ground, unscrewed carefully, not yanked. My mail was scattered on the lawn, but nothing missing. Just another warning. Inside, the motion-detecting security camera I'd installed above the porch had gone offline overnight. The footage for the past 12 hours was blank, wiped. When I checked the system log, it showed an unrecognized access attempt. I changed the password. Again, I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind made me reach for the baseball bat I now kept beside the bed. I knew they were watching. I knew they were trying to rattle me. And it was working, but only in part. The fear was real, yes, but so was the anger. It had settled in my chest like a second heartbeat. I wasn't just resisting them anymore. I was preparing for them. A few days later, someone called my office. HR asked me to step into a private meeting. I sat across from my supervisor, who looked uneasy. We received a complaint, she said. Anonymous. Said you were misusing company resources. Something about unauthorized data collection. Does that mean anything to you? My blood went cold. No, I said. I've done nothing like that. She looked at me, measuring. It's probably nothing. But the fact that someone went out of their way to make a report, someone who clearly knows where you work, that's what worries me. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. They were trying to collapse my life from the outside in. When I returned home that night, I noticed the camera across the street was pointing directly at my house. It belonged to the HOA. Officially, it was installed for traffic safety monitoring. But now, it had been subtly repositioned. Watching. Then came the inspections. At 3:11 a.m., I was woken by a loud knock at the door. Flashlights through the window. I grabbed my phone, turned on the hallway lights, and opened the door to find two men in blue windbreakers, both bearing the HOA logo. Emergency inspection, one of them said. It's 3 in the morning. We had a report of water damage and electrical hazards. No, you didn't. We need to verify the property is compliant. You're not getting in. They didn't argue. They just looked at each other, nodded, and walked off into the night. The next morning, a violation notice was taped to my door. Refusal of scheduled safety inspection. $200 fine. I didn't even bother tearing it down. I tried to reach Darren, the accountant who had given me the whistleblower files, but his burner number was disconnected. The email bounced. He was gone. Erased. Like the others. That day, my neighbor Denise finally cracked. She knocked on my door just before sunset, pale, trembling. You need to stop, she said. I know what you're trying to do, but you're making yourself a target. I already am. They're getting desperate. You exposed too much. They can't let you keep going. You knew. I asked. This whole time. She nodded. Everyone does. We just don't say it. So why are you talking to me now? Because you're not the first. But you might be the last. She hesitated. They watch my house, too. If they see me here. Then tell me now. I said. Tell me everything before you go. She took a breath, then let the flood loose. I've lived here 14 years. My husband tried to run for a board seat in 2015. 2 weeks later, he lost his job. Not long after, we got hit with over $1,000 in fines. Lights too bright, a tree limb overhanging the sidewalk, a wind spinner that reflected light into a neighbor's home. We paid, tried to stay quiet, but they didn't stop. He left, said he couldn't take it anymore. He blamed me for staying. I'm sorry. You should be, because you're waking them up again. And when they're awake, people get hurt. Then she left. I haven't seen her since. 2 days later, I came home and found my back gate open. My dog, the only living thing that kept me sane, was missing. No signs of a break-in. No damage. Just the gate, swinging softly in the wind. I called for him until my voice cracked. Walked the block 3 times. Nothing. That night, I found a single piece of mail in my box. No return address. No writing on the envelope. Inside was a photo. My dog, taken from behind a fence I didn't recognize. Beneath it, a sticky note with one line written in red ink. Time's up. It was the final push. They'd taken something from me they couldn't replace. And they expected me to fold like everyone else. To disappear. But they miscalculated. They mistook my silence for fear. It wasn't. It was the sound of something loading. Because I had already uploaded everything. I had backup drives mailed to trusted friends. I had names, dates, voices, numbers. I had a growing list of victims, each now willing to talk. And I had one more card left to play. They thought the retaliation would break me. But what they didn't understand was that I had already been broken. Now all I had left to do was strike back. It took everything I had not to run. The threats, the surveillance, the quiet violence. They were all designed to do one thing. Break me. But I was done being afraid. I was done being polite. I was done waiting for someone else to make it right. So I blew the whistle. It started with a single email. I sent it to every investigative journalist I could find. Reporters who'd tackled corruption, exposed police cover-ups, dismantled local government fraud. The subject line was simple. Whistleblower evidence. HOA corruption. Urgent. Attached were documents, audio files, video clips, financial spreadsheets, scanned board meeting transcripts, and a carefully written statement of events that had unfolded in Hollow Glen. Within hours, responses started coming in. Most were cautious, requests for interviews, verifications, the usual hesitations of professionals who'd seen too many crackpots and not enough proof. But one email stood out. It was from an independent journalist named Maya Jane, known for her relentless reporting on small-town corruption. She didn't waste time. Her message was short. I believe you. Let's talk. We set up a meeting in a public cafe an hour from the neighborhood. She came alone, wearing a gray blazer and eyes that scanned everything like a crime scene. I handed her a flash drive. Not the original, of course, but a copy. She didn't say much while she reviewed the files. Just took notes, asked clarifying questions. Her expression didn't change when she listened to the audio of HOA President Kessler bragging about flipping residents like cheap real estate. She didn't flinch at the pictures of mailboxes torn open, dogs gone missing, windows smashed. When she was done, she looked up and said, "We're going to take them down." Within a week, the first article hit the internet. Silent streets, dark deals, how an HOA became a private empire. It was explosive. The evidence laid out a coordinated scheme. Predatory fines used to displace homeowners, properties rerouted through shell corporations, embezzled HOA funds laundered through fake construction projects, private inspections conducted at night, retaliatory acts masquerading as policy enforcement. And names. So many names. It went viral in under 48 hours. Thousands of shares. Hundreds of comments. Some from Hollow Glen residents who had stayed quiet for years. Others from people across the country saying, "This happened in my neighborhood too." But the real impact came when Maya released the podcast episode. It wasn't just another true crime piece. It was a carefully produced audio documentary titled The Chime. She used my distorted voice, spliced with actual recordings from board meetings, interviews with former residents, and expert commentary on HOA overreach. The episode hit number 3 on the national charts in 3 days. Suddenly, the walls they had built around Hollow Glen weren't enough to keep the world out. Local news trucks began parking at the neighborhood's entrance. Reporters tried to interview residents, only to be chased off by hired security teams, the same ones that had once harassed me. Now, their aggression was being caught on camera. Then the legal inquiries began. The state attorney general's office launched an investigation. The county sheriff, under pressure from both media and public outrage, reopened old reports that had been mysteriously dismissed. Civil rights organizations stepped in, offering legal support to displaced residents. A class action lawsuit began to form, dozens of names joining, then hundreds. Some were neighbors I'd never met. Others were people who had once been afraid to even speak. HOA President Arthur Kessler tried to hold a press conference. He stood at the front of the community center, flanked by lawyers, claiming it was all a smear campaign. But halfway through his speech, someone in the back held up a large photo of their destroyed porch, the same porch that had appeared in one of the podcast episodes. Another held up a leash with no dog attached. The crowd turned. Kessler was indicted 2 weeks later on charges of wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. 3 other board members were arrested the same day. More followed in the days after, as investigators peeled back the layers of LLCs and shadow accounts. Contractors, fake inspectors, even a former city clerk, all tied into the scheme. The neighborhood, once silent and complicit, now buzzed with reporters, investigators, and residents eager to finally speak. I watched it all from the edge of it, never fully stepping into the spotlight, but never hiding either. Some people figured out who I was. A few came to my door to thank me. One elderly man from 2 streets overshook my hand with tears in his eyes and said, "I didn't think we'd ever get out." Not everyone was happy. A few neighbors were still angry, loyal to the old regime, claiming the media had ruined the neighborhood's reputation. But those voices were drowned out by something louder: truth. In the end, the HOA was dissolved. A temporary committee, formed by residents and overseen by county officials, took over governance until a proper election could be held. Policies were rewritten. Transparency became the rule. Fines were reviewed, most reversed. Refunds issued. Records opened. And in my front yard, where once there had been fear, I stood one bright morning and reinstalled my sister's Windchime. Not the old one, that had never been found, but a new one, crafted from metal, heavier, stronger. I had it custom made, with small steel chimes shaped like leaves. Each one was engraved with a name. People who had spoken out, people who had been silenced, people who had lost too much in the name of order. The wind carried its music down the street, soft but persistent. For a long time I stood and listened, not to the sound of helicopters or reporters or courtrooms, but to a chime that rang out not just because of the wind, but because no one could stop it anymore. They had fined me for that first wind chime, so I blew the whistle, and it echoed farther than they ever imagined.